He was 6'7" and built like a machine, the kind of man who walked into a wrestling arena in the 1950s and made people feel uneasy just by looking at him. His real name was Edward Spulnik, the son of Polish immigrants from Windsor, Ontario, who was supposed to live a normal life working as an electrical engineer. But that life never came. Instead, he became Killer Kowalski, one of the most feared and hated wrestlers ever. For 30 years, he dominated rings around the world, fought thousands of matches, injured opponents, and even became the first man to pin Andre the Giant in North America. After retiring, he trained future legends like Triple H, Chyna, and Kofi Kingston. This is the story of a man who scared millions in the ring, but outside of it was nothing like people expected. But before we get to the legend, we need to start at the beginning, because nothing about Killer Kowalski makes sense unless you understand where he came from and what drove him. Edward Spulnik was born on October 13, 1926, in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. His father, Antoni Spulnik, and his mother, Maria Borowska, were Polish immigrants who had crossed an ocean to build a better life. They settled in Windsor, just across the river from Detroit, Michigan, and raised 3 children. Edward had an older sister, Wanda, and a younger brother, Stanley. It was a working-class family. Hard-working people. The kind of people who didn't complain about what they didn't have, but instead put their heads down and made the best of what they did. Young Edward was different from the other kids almost from the start. By the time he was 14 years old, he was already well over 6 feet tall and still growing. Lanky, athletic, the kind of frame that caught your eye even in a crowd. He started training at the local YMCA, building up his body, channeling that restless teenage energy into something physical, something productive. He had plans, real plans. He enrolled at Assumption College, which would later become the University of Windsor, with the intention of studying electrical engineering, a solid career, a respectable path, the kind of thing that would have made his immigrant parents proud. And for a while, that's exactly what he did. He attended classes, he studied, and to pay the bills, he took a part-time job at the Ford Motor Company plant across the border in Detroit. $50 a week. Not bad money for a college kid in the late 1940s, but not great either. And it was while he was working at Ford, while he was splitting his time between textbooks and the assembly line, that someone planted a seed that would change everything. The story goes that while working out at the gym, someone looked at this towering young man with the athletic build and the relentless work ethic and suggested he could make a lot more money as a professional wrestler. This was the late 1940s. Television was just beginning to transform professional wrestling from a regional curiosity into a national phenomenon. Wrestlers were becoming celebrities. The money was getting better, and all you needed was the right look, the right attitude, and the willingness to put your body on the line night after night. Edward Spulnik had the look. He had the attitude, and as for putting his body on the line, well, he'd been doing that at the Ford plant every single day. At least in wrestling, there was a chance of making real money, so he made the decision. He walked away from engineering, he walked away from the steady paycheck at Ford, and he stepped into a world that would consume the next 3 decades of his life. In 1947, at the age of 20, Edward Spulnik made his professional wrestling debut. He wrestled under the name Tarzan Kowalski. Because of course he did. Look at him. 6'7", chiseled, with the kind of physical presence that made people stop and stare. Tarzan wasn't a bad name for a guy like that, but it wasn't going to last. Tarzan Kowalski was too friendly, too approachable, too much of a good guy. The wrestling business needed something else from Edward Spulnik. It needed a villain. Over the next few years, as young Kowalski worked his way through the wrestling circuits, he tried on different personas, like a man trying on suits. He was billed as Hercules Kowalski for a while. Some newspapers from 1950 and 1951 referred to him as the Polish Apollo. And somewhere in there, as early as 1950, a new name started appearing in the wrestling programs and newspaper listings. A name that would stick. A name that would become synonymous with fear and brutality and everything that made professional wrestling so compelling in its golden age. Killer Kowalski. Now, during the Cold War, the wrestling promoters decided to lean into something even more menacing. They changed his first name to Wladek Kowalski. It sounded foreign. It sounded threatening. It sounded like the kind of name that belonged to a man who would hurt you without a second thought. And in 1963, Edward Spulnick made it official. He legally changed his name. The kid from Windsor was gone. Killer Kowalski was all that remained. But here's the thing about Killer Kowalski in those early years. He was tall, he was imposing. He was a solid worker in the ring. But he wasn't a legend yet. He was just another big guy in a business full of big guys. He needed something more. He needed a moment. A single, defining incident that would transform him from a regular heel into one of the most notorious villains in the history of professional wrestling. That moment came on October 15, 1952, at the Montreal Forum. His opponent that night was a man named Yukon Eric. Eric was a lumberjack-type character, big, rugged, the kind of guy who looked like he chopped down trees for a living. The two men had been feuding as wrestlers do, and the crowd was hot. The energy in the forum was electric. And at some point during the match, Kowalski climbed up and launched himself off the ropes with one of his signature diving knee drops. What happened next would define his career forever. The knee connected with Yukon Eric's head, or more precisely, it connected with Yukon Eric's ear. And when Kowalski pulled away, part of that ear came with him. Now the reality of the situation was actually quite different from how it was reported. Yukon Eric's ears were already severely cauliflowered. Years and years of abuse in the ring had left them swollen, damaged, and fragile. The tissue was compromised. Blood clots had weakened the cartilage. So when Kowalski's knee made contact, the ear essentially disintegrated on impact. It was not like Kowalski deliberately tore it off with his bare hands, even though that is how the story would eventually be told. It was an accident, a gruesome, horrifying accident, but an accident nonetheless. Kowalski himself knew it was an accident, and he felt terrible about it. So he did what any decent person would do. He went to the hospital to check on Yukon Eric to see how his opponent was doing, to make sure he was all right. And that is when the second accident happened. The accident that would create the legend of Killer Kowalski. When Kowalski walked into that hospital room and saw Yukon Eric lying there, covered in bandages, looking like something out of a cartoon, something shifted. Years later, Kowalski would recall the moment with vivid clarity. He said the first thing he thought of when he saw Eric wrapped up in all those bandages was Humpty Dumpty sitting on a wall, and he could not help it. He started laughing. Now Eric was laughing too. The two of them were laughing together, two professionals who understood that accidents happen in this business, sharing a moment of dark humor about a ridiculous situation. Eric looked absurd with all those bandages. They both knew it, and they both found it funny. But a reporter was there, and that reporter did not see two colleagues sharing a laugh. That reporter saw a vicious, heartless monster visiting his maimed victim in the hospital and laughing at his suffering. And that is exactly how the story appeared in the newspaper the next day. Killer Kowalski visits hospital, laughs at opponent whose ear he ripped off. And just like that, a legend was born. The wrestling promoters, who understood the value of a good villain better than anyone, leaned into it immediately. Suddenly, Killer Kowalski wasn't just a big guy who was tough in the ring. He was a genuine monster, a sadist, a man who would maim you and then laugh about it while you lay bleeding in a hospital bed. The fans were horrified. The fans were outraged. And most importantly, the fans bought tickets. Lots and lots of tickets. Because they wanted to see someone, anyone, give Killer Kowalski the beating he so richly deserved. The EAR incident sparked a long-running series of grudge matches between Kowalski and Yukon Eric that drew massive crowds across North America for years. The two men traveled from territory to territory, city to city, replaying their feud in front of packed houses everywhere they went. It was the perfect story, the heartless villain versus the brave, disfigured hero seeking revenge. Wrestling at its purest and most compelling. And years later, when the feud had finally run its course and the houses were getting smaller, it was Yukon Eric himself who provided the perfect postscript. Looking out at a particularly sparse crowd one night, Eric turned to Kowalski and said, "That's a lousy house, I might have to sacrifice another ear." Even the victim understood what that ear had meant for both their careers. It was the best thing that ever happened to either of them, professionally speaking. But Kowalski wasn't just riding the wave of one infamous incident. He was legitimately one of the most talented performers of his era. His finishing move was the Iron Claw, sometimes called the Stomach Claw, a hold that looked absolutely devastating when applied by a man with hands the size of dinner plates. He was remarkably quick and agile for someone his size, able to move around the ring with a fluidity that bigger men simply weren't supposed to possess. He was smart, incredibly smart. Kowalski understood the psychology of professional wrestling on a level that few of his contemporaries could match. He knew how to work a crowd. He knew when to be vicious and when to be cowardly. He knew how to make the fans hate him with every fiber of their being, which in the wrestling business is the highest compliment a heel can receive. Throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, Kowalski was one of the biggest draws in professional wrestling. He worked territories across North America, from Montreal to California, from Texas to the Pacific Northwest. He traveled to Japan, where a televised 1963 match helped establish Giant Baba as a major star. He toured Australia, where he was enormously popular as a villain. Everywhere he went, the reaction was the same. Packed arenas, screaming fans, and an atmosphere of genuine menace that few wrestlers have ever been able to create. His rivalry with Bruno Sammartino became the stuff of legend. Sammartino held the Worldwide Wrestling Federation World Championship for nearly 8 years straight, and during that incredible reign, Kowalski was one of the perennial challengers. The two men headlined Madison Square Garden on multiple occasions, and their matches were brutal, physical affairs that left audiences exhausted. Neither man could decisively defeat the other, which only fueled the rivalry further. The fans needed to believe that Sammartino was in real danger every time Kowalski stepped into the ring, and Kowalski was so convincing as a villain that they genuinely did. He teamed with Gorilla Monsoon to form one of the most fearsome tag teams of the era. He faced Buddy Rogers for the NWA World Championship at Madison Square Garden. He won the IWA World Heavyweight Championship 5 times, the NWA Canadian Heavyweight Championship twice, the MAC World and International Heavyweight Championship an astonishing 12 times. And for a period during the 1960s, he wrestled under a mask as the Masked Destroyer, adding yet another layer to his already complex career. In late June of 1958, Kowalski found himself in the middle of another incident that only added to his fearsome reputation. He was wrestling Pat O'Connor in Boston, and the guest referee for the match was none other than Jack Dempsey, the former heavyweight boxing champion of the world. During the match, Dempsey took a kick to the diaphragm and had to be hospitalized. Both men insisted it was an accident. Dempsey himself didn't blame Kowalski at all. But the public didn't care about the details. All they knew was that Killer Kowalski had put a legendary boxer in the hospital, and that was all the evidence they needed to confirm what they already believed. This man was genuinely dangerous. Then came December 1972, and perhaps the most historic match of Kowalski's career. In Quebec City, Kowalski faced a young, relatively unknown French wrestler who was being promoted as the next big thing. His name was André René Roussimoff. The world would come to know him as Andre the Giant. Kowalski became the first wrestler to pin Andre the Giant in North America. Think about that. The first man to beat Andre, a figure who would go on to become arguably the most iconic professional wrestler of all time, was Killer Kowalski. The photographs from that match became enormously important for Andrei's career because they showed this unknown giant towering over the well-known Kowalski. If Andrei could make a veteran like Kowalski look small, then he must truly be something extraordinary. Kowalski had done the same thing years earlier in Japan with Giant Barber, using his own stature and reputation to elevate a younger talent. It was a generous act from a man who understood that the business was bigger than any individual performer. By the mid-1970s, Kowalski was winding down his full-time career. He had been wrestling for nearly 30 years. His body had absorbed punishment that most human beings could not even imagine. And while he was still capable of performing at a high level, thanks in large part to his remarkably disciplined lifestyle, he knew the time was coming to step away. In 1976, Kowalski joined forces with Big John Studd, one of his own trainees, to form a tag team called the Executioners. Managed by the legendary Captain Lou Albano, the team wore masks and captured the Worldwide Wrestling Federation World Tag Team Championship. It was a fitting final chapter for Kowalski's in-ring career, a chance to work alongside a younger wrestler he had personally trained, passing the torch in the most literal way possible. Kowalski officially retired from full-time competition in 1977. 30 years, 6,000 matches, countless championships. An era, a legacy that would endure long after the final bell. But retirement didn't mean Kowalski was done with wrestling. Far from it. He simply shifted his focus from performing to teaching, and in doing so, he created a second legacy that may ultimately prove even more important than the first. Kowalski moved to the Boston area and opened Killer Kowalski's professional wrestling school in Malden Square on Pleasant Street in Malden, Massachusetts. The school was modest. It wasn't a state-of-the-art training facility with fancy equipment and corporate sponsorship. It was a wrestling school, a ring, some mats, and the accumulated wisdom of a man who had spent 3 decades at the top of the most demanding profession in sports entertainment. What made Kowalski's school special wasn't the equipment, it was the teacher. Kowalski was a demanding, meticulous instructor who believed that wrestling was an art form that deserved to be treated with respect. He did not just teach his students how to take bumps and apply holds. He taught them psychology, storytelling, how to connect with an audience, how to make people believe in what they were seeing. He taught them the things that cannot be learned from a textbook or a YouTube tutorial, the things that can only be passed down from one generation to the next, from a master to his students, in the way that craftsmen have been teaching apprentices for centuries. And the students who came through his doors were extraordinary. The most famous of them all was a young man named Paul Levesque, who would eventually become known to the world as Triple H, one of the most successful and influential figures in the history of professional wrestling. Levesque showed up at Kowalski's school as a teenager from New Hampshire with nothing but a dream and an unshakable work ethic. Kowalski saw something in him immediately. He saw the drive, the intelligence, the willingness to do whatever it took to succeed. And he molded that raw material into something special. Triple H has spoken about Kowalski's influence on his career many times over the years. He credits the old man with teaching him not just the physical aspects of wrestling, but the mental approach that separated the good from the great. Kowalski demanded excellence. He demanded discipline. He demanded that his students treat the business with the same reverence that he did. And for a young Paul Levesque, that was exactly the foundation he needed. Then there was China. Joni Laura walked into Kowalski's school and turned heads immediately. A woman in a wrestling school in the early 1990s was unusual enough. A woman who was 6 feet tall, built like a fitness model, and utterly fearless was something else entirely. Kowalski trained her with the same rigor and attention to detail that he applied to all his students. He did not treat her differently because she was a woman. He held her to the same standard, and she rose to meet it. Chyna would go on to become one of the most groundbreaking performers in WWE history, shattering gender barriers in a way that nobody had done before. Perry Saturn came through the school. He went on to have a successful career in ECW and WCW. Kofi Kingston, who would eventually become WWE champion, trained under Kowalski. Big John Studd, who became one of the biggest attractions of the 1980s wrestling boom, was one of Kowalski's earliest trainees. Other notable trainees include Eddie Edwards, Frankie Kazarian, Damien Sandow, Fandango, Tommaso Ciampa, John Kronus, and Matt Bloom, who later became the head trainer at the WWE Performance Center. The list of wrestlers who traced their professional lineage back to that modest school in Malden, Massachusetts, is staggering. For a quarter of a century, Kowalski's school was a pipeline to the wrestling business. If you were a young, aspiring wrestler in the Northeast United States and you were serious about making it, Killer Kowalski's school was where you went. It was recognized throughout the industry as one of the premier training grounds in the country. Promoters knew that if a kid came from Kowalski's school, they had been properly trained. They knew how to work. They knew how to protect themselves and their opponents. They understood the business. They were ready. In 2003, as Kowalski's health began to decline, he made the difficult decision to sell the rights to his school. After nearly 60 years in the professional wrestling business, first as a performer and then as a trainer, Killer Kowalski finally stepped out of the spotlight. But let's talk about the man behind the character, because the gap between who Killer Kowalski was in the ring and who Walter Kowalski was outside of it might be the most fascinating aspect of his entire story. For starters, Killer Kowalski was a vegetarian, and not just a casual, sometimes I skip the steak vegetarian. He was a committed, dedicated vegetarian for more than 50 years. His diet consisted almost exclusively of salads and green vegetables. No meat, no fish, no poultry, nothing that had ever been alive. This came from a man whose entire professional identity was built around being the most vicious, most bloodthirsty villain in wrestling history. When people asked him about the apparent contradiction, about how a man called Killer could refuse to eat meat, Kowalski had a ready answer. He believed that consuming the flesh of animals was incompatible with spiritual growth. He was deeply philosophical about it. He believed that his vegetarian diet was one of the keys to his longevity in a profession that destroyed most men's bodies long before they reached his age. And he was right about the longevity part. While many of his contemporaries were broken down and barely mobile by their 50s, Kowalski remained remarkably fit and active well into his later years. His discipline was extraordinary. His commitment to physical fitness never wavered, even decades after his last match. Then there was the matter of his personality. The people who knew Walter Kowalski away from the cameras and the crowds described a man who was almost the complete opposite of his in-ring persona. He was warm, he was sensitive, he was funny. He had a dry, self-deprecating sense of humor that caught people off guard. His answering machine message was a gruff, playful recording that began, "You have reached, or rather you are trying to reach, Walter Kowalski." He was a poet, an avid photographer, a man of surprising depth and complexity. He preferred to be called Walter. "Killer was my professional name," he would say in that quietly intimidating, raspy voice of his. And there was something almost poignant about that distinction. For 30 years, he had been Killer Kowalski, the monster, the villain, the man who ripped off ears and laughed about it. But underneath all of that, he was always just Walter, a gentleman from Windsor who loved vegetables and poetry and taking photographs. He was deeply religious and enormously generous with his time and his name. For years, he was heavily involved with Suburban Special Needs of Middlesex, an organization based out of Stoneham, Massachusetts that raised funds to provide children with special needs the means to experience ordinary childhood events like summer camp. Kowalski would show up at fundraisers and charity events, using his fame and his larger-than-life presence to draw attention and open wallets for causes that mattered to him. The man who was booed as a monster in arenas around the world spent his free time helping disabled children go to summer camp. That tells you everything you need to know about who Walter Kowalski really was. Even after selling his school in 2003, Kowalski remained a fixture on the Northeast independent wrestling scene. He would show up at events, sign autographs, meet fans, and share stories from the old days. He was beloved by the independent wrestling community. These were not the big money events with television cameras and corporate sponsors. These were small shows in high school gymnasiums and community centers, put on by people who loved wrestling for its own sake. And Kowalski showed up for them because he loved the business too. Because he understood that wrestling was not just about the main events at Madison Square Garden. It was about every ring, every crowd, every young wrestler learning their craft in front of 50 people in a VFW hall. He did make some returns to the ring after his initial retirement. In 1982, he came back for some independent shows. In 1992, at the age of 65, he wrestled John Tolos to a no contest for Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling in Japan, and his final match took place in 1993 when he was 66 years old, losing to Baron von Raschke at a charity fundraiser show in Livingston, New Jersey. 66 years old and still stepping between the ropes, still doing what he loved. He even had a brief entertainment career outside of wrestling. He appeared on Late Night with David Letterman in 1982. He had a comic role in Michael Burlingame's surrealist film To a Random in 1986. Small moments, but they showed that Kowalski had a life and an identity beyond the wrestling ring. His last public appearance was on March 14, 2008, for Top Rope Promotions at an event in North Adams, Massachusetts. He came to the ring, applied his famous claw hold on a local wrestler named Gorgeous Gino Giovanni, and was declared the winner of the segment. The crowd went wild. Here was Killer Kowalski, 81 years old, still able to command a room, still able to make people believe, still connected to the business that had defined his life. On June 19, 2006, at the age of 79, Walter Kowalski married Teresa Dodd Ferrioli. The couple had met in a charmingly roundabout way. Teresa was in Jack's music shop on Pleasant Street in Malden, which happened to be right across from Kowalski's wrestling school. She noticed the shop owner's wrestling memorabilia and an introduction was arranged. Walter and Teresa hit it off and eventually married at St. Teresa Church in North Reading, Massachusetts. They settled into life together in Malden. It was a late-in-life love story for a man who had spent decades on the road, living out of suitcases, traveling from town to town. He finally had a home, a partner, a sense of peace. The wrestling industry recognized Kowalski's contributions in the way it knows best. In 1996, he was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. In 2002, the Cauliflower Alley Club, a fraternal organization of retired wrestlers, honored him with the Iron Mike Mazurki Award. In 2003, he was inducted into the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame and Museum as part of the Television Era Wing. These honors acknowledged what everyone in the business already knew. Killer Kowalski was one of the greatest to ever do it. Among those who fell to Kowalski during his career were some of the biggest names in wrestling history. Legends like Lou Thesz, Bruno Sammartino, Buddy Rogers, and Andre the Giant. These were not easy opponents. These were the men who defined their respective eras. Kowalski competed with all of them, held his own against all of them, and in many cases defeated them. His impact on the business extended beyond his own matches and his own students. Kowalski was part of a generation of wrestlers who understood that the villain was just as important as the hero, maybe more important. Because without a great villain, the hero has nobody to overcome. Without a Killer Kowalski, there is no triumphant Bruno Sammartino. Without the ear and the claw and the menacing sneer, there are no packed houses and no screaming crowds. Kowalski understood this instinctively. He embraced the role of the villain not because he was a bad person, but because he was a great performer who understood what the business needed from him. And he was ahead of his time in ways that went beyond his in-ring work. His commitment to vegetarianism and physical fitness in an era when most wrestlers were destroying their bodies with bad diets, excessive drinking, and worse, was nothing short of revolutionary. While his contemporaries were falling apart, Kowalski was thriving. He was proof that you could have a long, successful career in professional wrestling without sacrificing your health and your body in the process. That message resonated with the students who came through his school, many of whom adopted similar approaches to their own careers. Walter Kowalski passed away on the morning of Saturday, August 30th, 2008. He was 81 years old. He died in Everett, Massachusetts, not far from the Malden School where he had trained so many future champions. He was survived by his wife Teresa, his brother Stanley, and several nieces and nephews. His sister Wanda had preceded him in death. The wrestling world mourned him deeply. The news spread quickly through the industry, from the biggest promotions to the smallest independent shows. Triple H spoke publicly and privately about the enormous influence Kowalski had on his career and his life. Former students and colleagues shared memories of a man who was tough but fair, demanding but generous, feared in the ring, but beloved outside of it. The tributes poured in from across the industry, from legends who had competed against him to young wrestlers who had never seen him perform, but who had been trained by men and women who had learned at his feet. And that might be the most remarkable thing about Killer Kowalski's legacy. It does not end with him. It lives on in every wrestler he trained, and in every wrestler they trained, and in every wrestler those people will train in the years and decades to come. When Triple H runs the WWE and makes decisions about how young talent should be developed, some part of that philosophy traces back to a modest wrestling school on Pleasant Street in Malden. When Kofi Kingston performs in front of millions of fans around the world, some part of his foundation was laid by an old man with massive hands and strong opinions about vegetarianism. The chain is unbroken. 6'7", 275 pounds. A vegetarian who would not hurt an animal but who terrorized wrestling audiences for 3 decades. A monster in the ring who helped disabled children go to summer camp. A villain who produced heroes. A killer whose greatest weapon turned out to be his ability to teach. That was Walter Kowalski. That was Killer Kowalski. A man who scared the world and then taught the world how to do it better. A man whose legacy lives in every wrestler who ever walked through his door. Listened to his gruff voice breaking down the finer points of the craft, and walked out the other side ready to face the world. There will never be another one like him. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into the legends of professional wrestling. Until next time.